Welcome to Non-Beta Alpha, your source for unique insights into current market trends with host Ryan Morfin, CEO of Wentworth Management Services. Today we're discussing national security in the age of disinformation. We're joined by our guest, Duan Lee, Strategic Advisor to the Institute for Security and Technology, IST, and Professor of Politics at the University of San Francisco.
Duan, thanks for joining the show. We appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Well, a lot of our followers, a lot of our viewers have read the book 1984, and they think it's just fiction, but it's turned out to be perhaps a playbook for authoritarian regimes to really find the Achilles heel of our democracy. And you're one of the preeminent experts in talking about disinformation, misinformation, and what's been going on as it's continuing to become a tool to hyperpolarize the U.S. electorate against each other. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your background and a little bit about this risk that it poses to democracy.
Yeah, I think that's a great sort of intro to our conversation, Ryan. I think that's really helpful. A little bit about my background. I came to the States to go to graduate school, and my thesis was on how state actors may leverage and exploit foreign social movements or political movements as a cost-effective foreign policy tool, right? And back then, it was more like a theoretical exercise. Little did I know that it would be, one of the main facets of our political reality right now. And I went essentially about answering this question using a lot of quantitative modeling. So colloquially, people call me a nerd or a quant, right? And because of the background, when I got my first teaching job at the Naval Postgraduate School, I spent more time developing and executing technical projects on behalf of the US government, often working very closely with, DARPA, CPPSO, and OSD, right? So that's my background. And, one of the proudest projects I've ever executed was building this agile communication platform that enable our special operators to stay connected with their Iraqi counterterrorism partners, their Syrian partners. So if you see any of our guys or even Kurdish fighters holding a tablet or a cell phone, directing fires with our advisors, that's what we dub remote advise and assist. That was my puppy. And it's still widely used across several conflicts around the globe at this point. Now, shifting to disinformation and information warfare, I want to sort of give you three main characteristics to consider about what we are going through right now. And in fact, it's actually 3+1 because there is a big kicker after the third characteristic. So I call them scale, asymmetry, and predominance. So let me start with scale. And you'll have to bear with me a little bit because I'm going to share some statistics here. So typically we use this term MAU or MAU, monthly active users, right? So how many people are using different information exchange platforms every month? So for Facebook, it's about 2.7 billion a month, right? WhatsApp, 2 billion, YouTube, 2 billion. And then let me shift to some, not exotic, but foreign platforms. WeChat, 1.2 billion. TikTok, 800 million. Tencent, QQ, 695 million. Weibo, close to 600 million, right? VK, over 120 million. Line, 187 million active users every month, right? So think about all this information that is flowing through these platforms freely, right? And essentially uninterrupted. Now, so the volume is massive, right? So I work at a tech company in Silicon Valley. So we ingest and normalize a lot of different data sources, and we're trying to essentially enrich them. So enriching means that different data sources can be analyzed on the same analytic platform. We run 3 to 5 trillion inferences in our pipeline every single day, right? So the volume of information that affects our political reality or our political life is just, far beyond human capacity at this point, right? So like hand jamming, that is way out the window, right? Now, you must have noticed that I mentioned WeChat, Sina Weibo, VK, and Tencent QQ, and few other foreign media platforms, right? And this is where I'm going to talk about the second characteristic, asymmetry, and that is, especially the PRC and the Russian Federation, they have full access to our information sharing platforms, right? Do we have access to theirs? No, right? They're highly censored, highly controlled, right? So this creates like a strategic asymmetry, right? Where malign and revisionist actors can roam freely in our information environment, right? But we cannot do the same to them, right? And to me, this is a huge strategic liability that we need to address really, really fast, right? And I'm going to share some more stats to concretize this conversation, Ryan, because I'm tracking like a lot of Chinese Communist Party individuals, right, media outlets, and also like Chinese media outlets that are known to be very pro-regime, right? And I do the same thing for the Kremlin and Kremlin-affiliated media outlets. So if you want some examples, think about the Xinhua News Agency, CGTN, right? Chinese Global TV Network, right? On the CCP side, think about RT, think about Sputnik and whatnot on the Kremlin side, right? So I think, let's talk about some of these examples here. In the beginning of 2020, right? CCP affiliated social media accounts got only about 15,000 mentions, right? A day in the Western social media platforms, right? So I'm talking about Facebook, like, blogs, Instagram, Twitter, whatnot, right? Toward the end of 2020, that number increased by tenfold. So instead of 15,000, we're seeing 156,000 mentions on our social media platforms, right? That can be traced back to the Chinese Communist Party, right? The Kremlin has the same story, right? What it means is that traditionally the Chinese Communist Party used a lot of information technology to essentially enforce its political monopoly internally, right? So for political control, right? What has happened, especially with the COVID pandemic, is that the Chinese Communist Party decided to do external messaging at scale, right? And I'm going to give you a lot more examples where essentially the Chinese Communist Party has been the main perpetrator of systemic disinformation about the COVID pandemic, right? Or different types of COVID vaccines. And this is still going on in our backyard, right? Again, this goes back to the asymmetry, right? They roam freely in our information ecosystem, right? But we cannot return the favor. And I have a very specific example to share with your audience here, right? YouTube just 4 days ago took down 3,000 channels, right? I'm not talking about 3,000 clips, right? I'm talking about 3,000 channels with each channel having hundreds of, right, video clips, right? Because they were traced back to some forms of either CCP propaganda or Kremlin propaganda. Now, here's the kicker, Ryan. Out of those 3,000 channels, 2,946 of them were affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party, right? So this asymmetry is so lopsided. This is something that I feel really uncomfortable with, right? And I guarantee you, those are not the only pro-CCP channels that are operating on our information ecosystem right now, right? And let me move to the fourth example, characteristic, what I call predominance, right? And this should be fairly relevant to you, Ryan, because I know you're very active in essentially, aerospace technology, right? And other sort of, defense related, companies, right? And, what are some of the key domains where we compete against the Chinese Communist Party or the Russian Federation, right? So typically in DoD, we say air, sea, land, right? Cyber and information, right? And some people may throw in the human domain in there as well, right? Now, try to think about the past 10 years, right? How regularly do we face immediate national security threats in land, air, and sea? Perhaps 5 times a year at the most, right? I'm talking about immediate threats, right? So not general threats, but something that we can, oh my God, they're attacking our interests using air, sea, and land, right? I mean, we do have this incidents from time to time, especially around the South China Sea and around Taiwan, right? And of course, we've seen a lot of, airspace incursions from the Russian Federation, especially into the Baltics or the Balkans, right? But they are not very often, right? And frankly, we can deter them really, really well because when it comes to conventional military might, we still reign supreme, right? Now, let me ask you a different question this time, right? How regularly do we face, right, immediate national security threats in the cyber domain and in the information domain, right? It's every day, it's every hour, it's every minute, in every second, right? So to me, this is really, really straightforward, right? This is the space where we are actually regularly, right, and frequently competing against the Chinese Communist Party and the Kremlin. And I don't think, we are getting into this fray, right, quite effectively yet. So I'll stop there because I'm pretty sure you have more questions.
Yeah, and I was just watching the nominee for the CIA director, William Burris, his testimony, and he's saying that collecting intelligence today is no longer about having humans go walk around and collect it, just because of this persistent surveillance that exists with technology today. And it seems to me that the countries that are ahead of the curve here are the ones that are using user-generated data to create an AI, to create an intelligence framework to shape national priorities. In the environment that you're talking about, I mean, so some of these adversary countries, near peer countries, are in our data sets, are they able to create an intelligence picture of how to operate more effectively at influencing our elections, our economy, our political posture here in this country?
Of course. So I can give you three very specific, let's start with two examples, right? And I'm going to keep them fairly hypothetical, right? So it is not really hard to find, reports talking about how essentially Chinese intelligence services are collecting and exploiting what we call PII, right? Personally identifiable information on social media to essentially target, foreign overseas facilities that we may be running, right? In fact, a lot of our special operations sites have been exposed and compromised because of that. Because people posting where they're running this morning, right? So think about hey, I ran 5 miles this morning, and then you can actually get the data, right? Oh, by the way, this is not a registered military location, right? It doesn't take a genius to essentially connect the dots, right? And that creates a lot of operational security liabilities, right? I'll give you another example in that regard. So a lot of times, our sort of, personnel data has been frequently hacked, right? So in fact, in the past, 4 or 5 years, a lot of government officials with a clearance, right? That data, has been sent to Beijing, right? And that creates a lot of national security issues, especially think about our public servants doing sensitive activity overseas and whatnot, right? And also this is a huge business liability, right? So, I sort of, research Huawei very carefully, right? In terms of the extent of IP theft, right? And also unauthorized data breach, right? And essentially, at midnight, you have essentially your computer system sending personnel data to another data center, perhaps in Shanghai or Macau or Hong Kong for that matter, right? And these things have taken place with increasing frequency. So to me, this is a huge national security risk, as well as a very general risk to the business community. And I'll give you sort of a quick sort of acronym here, and that is, so when we talk about open source intelligence, we typically talk about 4 V's, right? The volume, the veracity, right? The variety, and veracity, right? So the last V, so I mean, most people can understand, can imagine what they stand for, right? The volume of information is so overwhelming, right? But it's not just text data, right? The variety, right? Pictures, memes, stories, hashtags, right? Short form content, long term content, right? So try to essentially, understand all these different types of content to generate what we call a common operational picture or common intelligence picture. This is becoming really challenging, right? And essentially velocity is how quickly people can upload, right? And share information. So the last one is veracity. And that is the reason that open source intelligence is becoming such a critical element of our IC intelligence community is that if you can stitch all different types of information, you can get to what we call ground truths really well, right? So imagine how costly it may be, going back to the first example, imagine how costly it may be to essentially employ technical means or human collectors to find your adversaries like sensitive military sites. It could take months, it could take millions of dollars, right? But if you can do it using open source intelligence, right? It is literally at your fingertip, right? It's literally, you just do a few algorithms with your keyboard, right? And boom, you spend an hour and now you have located a black site, right? So I think that's the game we are playing right now.
Well, and so I'm gonna maybe take a step back and explain what I think I heard, and then try to distill that down for the so what's. So it seems to me that there's a tremendous amount of data being given to tech companies today, and users, consumers don't care or don't know that their data is being filtered and shared, whether overtly or covertly, into data servers, where foreign governments or adversaries or even companies, for that matter, can create an intelligence picture and feed that data through to artificial intelligence, where decision makers, business owners, people looking for lead gen, they can then go ahead and ask that artificial intelligence questions that will produce ground truth answers quickly. And is that an accurate statement?
Oh yes, absolutely. And the technology is actually quite mature at this point, right? So we call them automated text summarization or data summarization, right? You can use what we call natural language processing for text, data, or you can use other types of, deep learning algorithms to generate the same, output, right? Now, the reason this is so important is that, right, you cannot, humanly process so much information on a daily basis to paint an accurate intelligence picture, right? And frankly, we do actually this really well, right? But we don't do this at scale, right? I think the difference between our mindset and the CCP mindset is that they're doing this automated intelligence collection and intelligence analysis, right? At scale, right? Especially exploiting our data, right? I don't think I mean, technically, I think we're just as good, just to be honest with you, right? However, the scale is really tipped in favor of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, and that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today is that, in a worldview, in a government socio-economic structure where individual rights and privacy do not exist, they're subordinated to the cause of the government's goals. As Americans, I think a lot of individuals would prefer to have their privacy, do not know that it's being taken from them, but don't understand, I think, the extrapolation of that next step, which is an infringement on your rights. I mean, there's places in Orange County where algorithms are deciding if you're about to commit a crime or collecting genomic data to try to pin a potential murder on you, and you may not have been anywhere near the site. Can you tell me what's going on to what I'll call individual rights and privacy and individual freedom in some of these authoritarian regimes that can run unfettered with no constitutional rights? Now that the technology's there, the data has been given to them, what are they doing and how is their society changing, and how is that a precursor for Americans on both sides of the equation to wake up and demand some accountability from the technology companies?
Yeah, I think that's a really tough question, Ryan, because I'll have to use a word that can be quite polarizing, and I think it starts with the letter R, right? It's called regulation, right? And think about this. This is a really toughie because there are essentially 50 shades of gray between free speech and regulation, right? So pick your poison, so to speak. However, I do think that there is a political issue that we are not being honest about, and that is essentially the public, whether that's individual citizens or the federal government or your state government, right? We have derelicted the obligation to maintain both public integrity and free speech. We essentially abdicated that authority to the tech industry in the past 20 years. And we are essentially experiencing, right, all the consequences of that abdication as far as I'm concerned. I do think, if you look at the current congressional session, right, there are a lot of hearings taking place in this space. And also you will see that a lot of tech companies are actually being very proactive, right? Essentially to delay the onslaught of top-down regulation. I cannot really predict which way this will go, but I do think that there'll be more, co-regulation taking place this year. But that's just our homeland, right? That does not solve the geopolitical angle that you're referring to. And that is, look, we may have the most sophisticated legal structure, right? Where we can have both free speech and public integrity, right? I think we'll get there, right? But, we cannot export those rules or those laws to the rest of the world. And I think the geopolitical aspect of this conversation is a lot harder. And this is why, whenever I talk to people who are more important than me, right, especially in the Beltway, right, it's not so much about just our, norm setting, right, but essentially we need to re-engage, IGOs, international governmental organizations, right? And I think the European Union has been somewhat, more active in this space, right? But I don't think their norms will work in our context, right? But that doesn't preclude this necessity that we, the United States, has to lead how essentially the world sets certain norms about privacy, data, right? And essentially individual freedoms. Because look, we are at an inflection point that, right? If we lose this momentum, right? We started this conversation with 1984, right? Like literally, we are at that inflection point, whether we stay open or we go Orwellian, right? And there's only way we can avoid, or we can essentially shift that inflection point in favor of our way of life, right? And that is really getting aggressive about global norms of data sovereignty, data privacy, right? Data essentially integrity and whatnot.
So the Republicans were really upset, right, when this right to be forgotten and all the regulation against Facebook and the social media companies in Europe was happening a few years ago. Fast forward to January of this year, now they're all upset about censorship. Do you think the Europeans are ahead of U.S. thought leaders on the regulatory environment? And do you think a European regulatory framework will be imposed eventually here in the States on these, well, I'll call them data aggregators that are just grabbing consumer data and profiting off it?
Again, those are well beyond my areas of expertise or, familiarity. So let me just caveat my answer with that, because, I'm a recovering, lowly, government academic, right? I love playing with technology. I work with a lot of, tech companies. So that's sort of, my sandbox, right? I'm not a policy expert, or I'm not a policy maker. However, I do follow that space very carefully. And what I've seen, from the current administration is that they're essentially working very closely with our European allies and partners, right, to re-engage in that international norm setting space, right? So I remain optimistic, right? And let me give you a couple of data points that can substantiate my optimism. Um, in case you haven't noticed, Facebook has been really busy putting a lot of ads, right, everywhere, right? And the common theme they've been pushing for the past, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 months was that we support, a new internet regulation. That's what they're proactive, essentially PR, right? And also there is another data point that should give you some hope, and that is essentially like, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Amazon, and a few other companies essentially decided to promote integrity over, right, maximum content in Australia. So they have come out with agreement to clamp down on what we call, inauthentic content or inauthentic behavior, right? So if you look at some of these emerging, like, examples, right? I think, there might be what I call a democratic consensus on, right? How we should regulate, not regulate, how we should govern, right? Both, publicly and privately, how to govern data related, privacy issues, right? And this is not a bad thing, right? Because now, this is going to add to this notion of building a global coalition of democracies against what we call the revisionist regimes, right? So typically in national security, we call them 4+1, right? The CCP, the Kremlin, the Iranian regime, the DPRK, also known as North Korea, right? Plus violent extremist organizations, right? So to me, this, I'm seeing a lot of positive signs that, democratic countries will come together to build this multi-pronged coalition, right? Against, especially against the Chinese Communist Party and the Russian Federation. However, can I just add a quick footnote?
Yeah.
It does, like, I have a, like, article coming out on foreign policy about this in the next couple of days, and that it is, so, like, investors and business owners, I think they should be hyper cautious about, like, how they conduct their activities internationally moving forward, right? Because they should expect a lot more geopolitical externalities, right? So, like, doing business in the CCP is gonna be a lot harder, right? It's not just the Chinese Communist Party, right? But, from the EU, from us, right? from other democratic countries, perhaps in Asia, right? They will face a lot of political externalities doing business in the CCP or in the Russian Federation. And I think, risk mitigation or risk assessment, especially geopolitical risk assessment, will be key for them to essentially, strategize where to invest and where to grow.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. I do think, we saw with the bombing in Syria this week, I do think there's a lot more conflict than less coming in the coming months ahead. Maybe you can explain to our listeners, so the concept information warfare isn't widely talked about, how information warfare is a tool in the portfolio of economic warfare and how it might be being used today in America.
Yeah, so I think, let me give you a very quick example, right? I think, this is going to like crystallize why this matters to us, right? And, I talked to a lot of, state and local government officials about what we call Covet messaging, right? So like, hey, this is when you're going to get your vaccine, this is where you should go and yada, 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 right? And an unhealthy country cannot compete really well against, especially authoritarian regimes, right? And guess what? The Chinese Communist Party and the Russian Federation, they've been amplifying all kinds of, right, conspiracy theories about the origin of the coronavirus, right? And like, if you just Google like, Bill Gates and like, corona, virus, you'll get a ton of like just far-fetched conspiracy theories, right? But because like, what I do every day is essentially looking at millions of data points pertaining to national security issues, right? I can tell you as a true statement, some of these fringe narratives are almost always amplified, shared, and exploited by the Chinese Communist Party or the Kremlin, right? So we did make a lot of mistakes handling the pandemic, right? Especially about a year ago in the beginning of it, right? A lot of, foreign agents and essentially government organizations have made it a lot worse than it should have been in the first place, right? And let me add another example to like enrich this conversation a little bit, Ryan. So we don't get to sell right 12 billion doses of anything, right? Very often, right? So imagine that everyone in the world has to get 2 doses of some vaccine, right? And you know that we have several vaccines, right, developed here in the United States, right? But the CCP has a couple, right? The Kremlin has a couple, right? I mean, think, and we are paying for all these vaccines. They're not free, right? Somebody's paying for these vaccines, right? And all these pharmaceutical companies are making a killing right now, right? But imagine how effective it could be if perhaps pro-CCP, like online elements, essentially spread, right? False stories about non-existing side effects of the Pfizer vaccine, right? And it can essentially, amplifying certain stories that, hey, somebody actually died, getting this Pfizer vaccine, right? And I've seen these stories essentially being actively amplified by pro-Chinese social media accounts, both here in our country and in, East Asia, right? And essentially this creates a lot of uninformed sentiments about, right, the vaccination. So people are refusing to take these vaccines, right? So the Chinese economy is recovering faster, right? But because, especially the CCP and the Kremlin have been exploiting our public health crisis, we're not coming out of this pandemic faster than we could, right? And to me, this is essentially, how they undermine our resiliency, right? And public health using nothing but information warfare, right? And like, just to like, sum up, right? imagine, I talked about the domains, right? Imagine what it would take the Chinese Communist Party, right, to achieve the same damage on our resiliency using air, sea, land, right? Now imagine how easily they achieved the same effect using nothing but cyber warfare and information warfare, right? To me, this is the ultimate, what we call remote warfare system.
Well, I think to your point, air, sea, land domains, right? There's unfortunately for society, for the globe, there's no way a war could go on where there's not mutually assured destruction with nuclear warheads, with nuclear powers. And so I think Americans need to wake up and realize the only way that the Chinese can leapfrog us as the predominant power and the strongest economy is through these soft power measures. And we need to protect ourselves because we've never had a peer advisor or a peer adversary rather come at us from this perspective. And I think to your point, absolutely employees are falling victim across the country to bad information about the vaccine or about the shots, the symptoms, how bad it has really been in certain parts of the country, and it's creating I wanted to say a mental health issue for the workforce in the United States, where it's going to have a negative impact on GDP, and GDP is often a relative metric for growth. China had 4.6, we may have negative 4.7 for last quarter, and I think that's the way they leapfrog us. And I think this is the mechanism, information warfare, is the way they slow us down on our recovery. And I just don't know why the business community and the government community aren't talking more about this to educate people. Be careful where you get your news from, because we're all being played the sucker.
Yes, I mean, that's I couldn't have said it better, Ryan, right? In fact, I think I should be the host and you should be the guest for this conversation. However, and you're wearing a nice tie, so you should be the guest, right? Not me. However, right? I think you're touching on something really critical that most our fellow American citizens are not appreciating enough. So let me just double down on something that you touched on, right? And this is going to be a little bit long-winded, right? So I've been teaching deterrence and strategy for the past, 15 years, 12 years, mostly for DoD and, IC and DOS, right? And I remember 15 years ago, I was teaching this class on, great power competition. In academia, we call that the power transition theory, right? 15 years ago, most top tier political scientists, economists predicted that the Chinese economy would overtake the US economy not until the 22nd century, right? Fast forward 5 years, right? Now the same economists, right? And political scientists are saying that, there's a good chance that the Chinese economy may overtake the US economy by 2075, right? Fast forward 5 more years. Now it'll happen by 2050, right? And literally just a couple of months ago, I was reading this forecasting report from the UK-based Center for Economics and Business Research, right? And they were looking at the same macroeconomic metrics that you just mentioned, right? How the Chinese economy may grow coming out of this pandemic, and how the US economy may recover from this pandemic, right? And you mentioned the GDP, absolutely. So let's run some numbers. What's our current GDP? It's about 21.5, give or take, right? Trillion, right? The Chinese GDP right now is about 15.3, give or take. I mean, of course, they massage their books, so we cannot trust everything at face value, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close to 15.3 trillion, right? Now, the CEBR says that the Chinese economy, because of the pandemic, and I will add my own flavor there, and that is because the Chinese Communist Party has weaponized disinformation and this pandemic, right? And of course, we dropped the ball, like literally we dropped the ball, since, from between March and like October, right? Let's just be honest about that, right? Now the Chinese economy is most likely to overtake ours by, brace yourself, 2028. That is 7 years from now on, right? So a lot of times when I talk to policymakers or DoD leaders, I always ask them, I try to give them a good scene setter, right? How on earth did we lose, right? About 75 years in the past 10 years. Now, if you reverse that question, right? What is imperative on us is that in the next 3-4 years, we got to earn back 75 years to stay ahead of the Chinese Communist Party. That is what is at stake, right? In order to achieve that effect, right, we cannot stay defensive. I mean, and this is why I don't really like a lot of training missions, right? Because that's not going to cost. I mean, that's not going to impose a lot of disproportional cost, especially on the Chinese Communist Party. Look, I think the Kremlin is a very malicious actor, right? It's a really annoying threat. But their GDP is about 1.6 trillion. I mean, it's smaller than Italy. In fact, it's smaller than Texas, right? So to me, it makes no sense that still so many people are preoccupied with the Kremlin and not paying enough attention to the menace of the Chinese Communist Party. And to paraphrase you again, this is why I was so encouraged by Burns' confirmation hearing, right? I think it happened like 2 days ago, right? The reason I was so encouraged was that if you look at his profile, he's a really strong Russia hand, he's a really strong Iran hand, right? But he was saying that it's China, China, and it's China, right? So we're coming around, but we need a lot more awareness, especially among our business leaders, and of course, with our fellow American citizens.
Well, and look, and it's not and some people say it's a racist thing. It's not. Chinese food, Chinese culture is amazing, but it's a system of government. Had it been Taiwan having this growth or South Korea, we'd be celebrating democracy. But I think the business community needs to realize with a preeminent economic superpower like China, it uses and weaponizes its economy against its people and its satellite states. And I think we need to understand that if we don't get ahead of this as Western democracies, a lot of capitalism is going to move from the free market capitalism, free trade capitalism that we enjoy in the 20th century to a perverted form, and unfortunately, of crony capitalism, where only the party enriches themselves. And if you look at just what's happening there's still a lot of poor Chinese people across the country. They haven't all had this middle class effect that we saw in Western democracies in the 20th century. And so it's a very concerning dichotomy of, like you said, Orwellian future versus an open future that I think people don't realize when they're buying stuff cheaper, a little bit cheaper, a few dollars cheaper, and it's not made in America or it's not made in an allied trade partner that does fair trade and lives up to their agreements, that you're hurting the U.S. economy in the long run.
Absolutely. Again, Ryan, I couldn't have said it better, right? And there are some historical priors perhaps we can learn from, right? So, I love talking about the last power transition, and it happened in the late 19th century. And that was between the UK and us, right? And in the first half of the 20th century, we ended up saving, right, the liberal global order, right, by getting into World War I and World War II and winning the Cold War, right? Now, you said something really incredibly insightful there, right? The transition between the UK to us for global leadership was fairly smooth, right? Because both superpowers had compatible, if not similar, right, interests and norms about how to govern global affairs, right? Now, when this compatibility doesn't exist, right, typically you get really catastrophic conflicts, right? World War I was one example, right? Essentially the war to end all wars was the most catastrophic war, right? In the first, in the beginning of the 20th century, right? So this is what, keeps me awake at night, right? Because you are absolutely correct, right? If it's Taiwan, right, essentially like, outputting, right, $17 trillion a year, right? I'll be completely at ease, right? In fact, I would encourage my friends, hey, invest in Taiwan, 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 right? But I think, we are essentially underestimating what kind of surveillance technology and surveillance governance that the Chinese Communist Party is exporting, right? Because this is what every great power does. That is, what is the best way to secure your external environment? Make it like yours, right? So that way, right, you don't have to crush them every day, right? Turn them into your mirror image, then you'll be secure. And in fact, this language is very pervasive in Chinese strategic, culture, right? And I don't think we are appreciating the danger this presents, right, to the international liberal order.
To your point, I'm reading a book right now about the history of the Opium Wars, which is something that the Chinese are very upset about, and the British did to them. They addicted their population to heroin, and I believe, and I don't know if you agree with this comment, the corollary is their cheap hardware and software that they're pushing and buying market share with is creating, like you said, a mirror image of the surveillance state. Whether these countries' governments know it or not, they're buying this technology, implementing it in their 5G, in their school systems, in the local government, and not realizing that it's like the heroin in the 19th century that led to, the big problems that China had to unwind in the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've been addicted to, those elements far too long, right? And I think that's a very apt analogy, Ryan. And perhaps I'll steal it and use it for some other, like, keynote speeches myself. I mean, that's really good, by the way. So like, weaning this, addictive behavior, will take some time, right? And to me, I think it has to start with, both political leaders and business leaders, right? Because political leaders can talk about this all day. I can talk about this all day, right? But it is the business leaders that can actually make most impactful decisions. And that is, you know what? I'm going to pull my production base from the CCP. I can perhaps move it to Vietnam, right? Vietnam and China have a lot of historic animosities, right? So essentially, you're not going to lose. I mean, your margin will be fine, right? In fact, Vietnam has an amazingly well-educated labor force, right? And technologically savvy and whatnot, right? So business leaders actually have a big role to play in this regard, right? We have seen some capital flight from the PRC in the past, like perhaps 2 years, but it's a drop in the bucket, right? And look, unlike us, right, the Chinese economy, it is much more dependent on global trade than we are, right? In fact, we are still very much insulated, right? In fact, we produce more oil than the Saudi regime at this point, right? So again, we have some inherent strategic advantages, right? But it'll take both political leaders and business leaders to actually take advantage of our inherent advantages at this point, Ryan.
Well, and to your point, business leaders need to reevaluate, this we'll call just-in-time supply chain to, just-in-case supply chain, which means, we were always about, only keeping enough supply chain in the U.S. as necessary and outsourcing the rest to cheap labor economies. But I think COVID taught us that when there's a real pandemic, they're going to take care of their own people first, as they should. But it's business leaders and politicians who've let their people down. I mean, the fact that we had a crisis to get PPE into the hands of doctors and nurses is ridiculous. Question though, and this is what people don't understand, is that a lot of these universities, these public pension boards, a lot of these huge globalist corporations, technology firms, their board members are making lucrative deals individually with foreign governments and changing the way capital flows. And the conflicts of interest that have at least have appeared on my radar are astounding. Is there anyone tracking this from your perspective? And I mean, if the Chinese are going to be implementing soft power techniques in the U.S. economy, this seems like a natural play for them. Is there any type of mechanism to do a scoring on our institutions, our economic institutions, our educational, our business institutions, about how compromised the leadership may or may not be given conflict of interest? In my business, if there's a conflict of interest, it must be disclosed. Why is it not disclosed on the boards of public companies and university systems?
Again, I'm a little bit hesitant to answer this question because I have no expertise to offer. I'm just being honest, Ryan, right? But also it's also a hot potato, right? I mean, there's no right answer to the question. So you're trying to interrupt me, and I'm not gonna spring the trap, right? However, I'll say this much, right? So we have this, Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States, right? And a lot of, large scale investors or business leaders, track, this committee very carefully. This committee has been a lot more active recently, right? And I am certain, 100% certain that the new administration will empower, right, this committee even more. In fact, there is something, not so obvious to the general public, but, the Commerce Department, has an amazing investigative authority and also team, right? And I've seen their action, a few times. So we're getting our act together, Ryan. And look, but we've been addicted to this, economic opium, as you put it, for the past 30 years, right? So this is still the largest economy in the world, if not in history, right? It's not easy to shift course, change course right away, right? And it'll take some time, but I've seen really positive indications that we're getting our shit together right now, right? And if you look at, I follow DOJ and the FBI very carefully. God, we are essentially arresting and putting away a lot of industrial, spies, right? Deep, embeds from the PLA and etc., right? So we are doing the right thing. However, there is a very important caveat I do want to emphasize here, and that is the way we, imagine industrial espionage is not the same way the CCP, thinks about the concept, right? So typically we use this word privateer, right? And that is they do employ a lot of unwitting people, right? Who may serve the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I don't think we should vilify them, right? That's a completely different matter, right? In fact, I think that'll be a really damaging move on who we are, right? As a nation, right? It'll be a terrible blow to our soul, so to speak. And I do think it's a very delicate matter, right? Because we do essentially receive, economic vitality, depends a lot on, investment, right? So we need to be a little bit deliberate and careful about this business because we don't want to dampen, right, the innovative spirit of our economy, right? Because we still are the most innovative economy in the world, right? And no matter what we do, we should never dampen that, spirit.
No, our economic resiliency is our crown jewels, if you will, innovation and education. And so I couldn't agree with you more. Well, speaking to a lot of our viewers, people who have kids or even younger listeners to this show, the way we consumed and interacted with information and media, even 20 years ago is substantially different today. And TikTok, all these kids on, elementary school kids getting on social media with their phones. What advice do you have for parents? Do you have, one phone with your social media apps and one phone for your email? Like, how do you keep your, we'll call your digital cyber posture hygienic?
Yeah, I mean, that's God, you ask a lot of tough questions, Ryan. So there are two sort of, buckets of answers to that question, Ryan. On one hand, yes, we do need to promote what we call, digital literacy, right? Or cyber citizenship. This is something that my friend Peter Singer promotes a lot, right? Essentially, hey, we need to include, this essentially like, lessons plans in every elementary school, right? Even kindergarten, right? And there are other countries who do this really well, such as like Estonia, Finland, right? Norway, right? Essentially, before they start using their first iPad, right? They learn about privacy issues, and then perhaps like, exploitation on social media, right? How to protect your PII, personally identifiable information. You didn't post anything about, personal things and whatnot, right? So, look, it'll happen, right? It'll happen, and it'll become much more like prioritized moving forward, right? And there are tons of bills in Congress by now addressing how to essentially fund and enable, right, different educational programs on digital literacy and cyber citizenship, right? So yeah, I mean we can do that, but I'm going to get a little bit casual and a little bit goofy for the following, bucket of answers. I think trying to turn everyone smart is a false errand. It's not scalable, right? I mean, there'll always be like, uninformed people. There'll always be, essentially, susceptible people to malign influence or foreign, influence and whatnot, right? And we have this like really unique sense of individual freedom in our country, right? So like telling people, hey, you need to, I was with DoD for a long while. The one thing that I hated the most was mandatory training, right? I was spending like 40% of my like professional life doing nothing but like really idiotic online training, right? I don't think that's the solution, right? I think the other bucket of solutions should be essentially providing what I call ecosystem level solutions, right? So like, I'll give you an example. Do you have kids, Ryan?
Yep, I do.
How old are they?
Oh, they're still in grade school.
All right. Do you mind telling me how old they are?
Yeah, 7, 6, and 2.
That's good. If they wanted to get your car key and go around the block, would you let them do it?
Well, they're already asking for it, so absolutely not.
And we have certain like training, right? Or certain knowledge that we require for anybody to be able to drive a car, right?
That's right.
When you see a R-rated movie on your TV set, do you let your kids to stay with you or you kick them to their bed? The latter, right?
Generally not. Yeah, that's right. You
Yeah.
got to have some constraints. Yep.
So what I mean by ecosystem level solutions is that, look, we have technical solutions that can generate it, highly sophisticated markers of different content, right? Hey, where did it come from? Oh, it came from the PRC or like, from like, Moldova or from the Russian Federation, right? Hey, who has amplified this content? Oh my God, CCP affiliated media outlets are responsible for the 80% of this amplification, right? So this is what we do with, right? A lot of media content, whether those are TV series, right? Whether it is like movies and whatnot, right? So we essentially provide that context to the consumer, right? And that is, hey, yes, this is a great movie, but this is R-rated, so don't bring your 5-year-old to watch this movie, right? I don't know why we don't provide that context when it comes to, right, social media or publicly available information writ large. I understand that we have this Communication Decency Act, especially Section 230. I get that, right? but we will revisit that point this year. I guarantee you, right? Because I think the threat is so pressing right now. I don't think we can just let it go free at this point. So to me, without those ecosystem level solutions, it's really hard. And let me give you another example, Ryan. So I love potato chips, right? I love junk food, right? It's my comfort food, after a long day of work, right? I love nothing but a small bag of chips just to reward myself, right? But on the back of each bag of potato chips, there's a little label that tells you how unhealthy it is for you to have 10 bags of that, right? That's the context, right? So instead of eating 5 bags of potato chips, perhaps I'll have just one, right? Perhaps I'll have only half a bag and seal it back, right? I don't know why for social media and publicly available information, we don't provide that context to the end user, right? So even if you're not very sophisticated, even though you may not be the most critical, accomplished critical thinker, right? You have that context to understand whether the information you're consuming is authentic or not, right? I think those are the solutions we need to provide.
No, so I think content grading for all the stuff that's on YouTube for kids is a great idea. And you're right, we do it for movies. It's probably not too hard for content providers just to click a toggle so there's a technical on or off switch for people under 10 and people under 18 and everyone thereafter. But question for you, so these state actors that are pushing information through social media to try to effectuate propaganda in our country, are they only focusing on the fringes, like the alt-right and the extremist left, or are they also pervading kind of mainstream thought as well? And I look at QAnon, more of an alt-right issue, and it's interesting. It also popped up now recently in France, and so I don't know if this is a tool from a foreign adversary against democracy trying to cause chaos, or if they've just got these kind of fringe groups that they're really toking to be domestically disruptive to a political process.
I think, I would say that it's a little bit of both. I've seen both, right? But I think, we're talking about strategy and tactics, right? I think the strategy is really, right, keeping your strategic competitors, right, as distracted and as divided as possible, right? Because if you cannot get your house in order, right, how are you going to compete externally? So to me, that's the strategic intent. The tactics or the TTPs they use to achieve the strategic effect, right, can vary from country to country, right? And frankly, I've seen QAnon content in France. Oh, by the way, Brazil is a hotspot for QAnon right now. And they're merging with anti-vaxxers, right? And essentially, this is going to be another, hotbed condition for conspiracy theories. So there are a lot of transnational dynamics, but frankly, they're dangerous. I can tell you they're dangerous, but I actually focus on, what I call inauthentic amplification only, right? Because look, we have free speech. There are crazy people out there. I have a bunch of crazy relatives, right? And this is why we have so many jokes about Thanksgiving dinner, right? That's America, right? We are very different. Look, you and I have perhaps not a lot in common when it comes to hobbies and things like that, right? You look handsome, I'm ugly, right? You look tall, I'm not very tall, right? But that's America, right? I don't think we should try to control what is mainstream or what is not mainstream, right? In fact, perhaps that's what enabled a lot of these fringe elements in the first place.
Yeah, no, I think your point about that inauthentic scaling of amplifying a message that's purely false is what I'm talking about, and that's only being done through nation-state organizations, intel organizations, and it's not the Chinese people; it's the government the CCP, that's trying to promote this. It's the Kremlin, right? Yeah, and it's not the Russian people; it's not the Chinese people, but the Americans on the fringes need to realize they're most likely being played with information warfare, and they don't even know it because it's coming in through Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, but imagine, right? So, this is what we call a social proof, Ryan, right? So this, that's exactly where I was going, right? And that is, if they realize, right, what they are sharing in their private Facebook groups, right? Or what they are sharing with their encrypted chat apps, right? Is actually coming from these awful autocratic regimes, right? Troll farms, bots, sock puppets, right? Hijack accounts and whatnot. And we have the technical means to surface those inauthentic characteristics, right? And if they have that context, right, they're going to be, at least they'll think twice before they share that inauthentic content with their friends, right? Texting the link to your friend, right? Hey, look at this. Essentially it was like, Antifa guys who attacked the Capitol building on January 6th, right? Before you do anything like that, you'll think twice because you realize, oh my God, 80% of this story has been amplified by CCP affiliated trolls, bots, sock puppets, and whatnot, right? So providing the context to surface malicious and malign external amplification is really key to combat this information warfare without undermining some of the principles that underpin who we are as Americans, right? And to me, finding that sweet spot is really key, right? Otherwise, we'll end up exacerbating this ongoing polarization process.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. No, listen, I've been following you online for over a year now, and your commentary on these issues is spot on and very insightful. Well, and this is the kind of the last few questions of the show, and I'd love to talk to you just more yes/no types of answers. These are the same 7 questions that we ask at the end of every episode to all of our guests, and so feel free to answer yes or no, or put as much or little content as you'd like. All right, here we go. So first question. Now that we have a vaccine available, would you take it, yes or no?
Yes.
Second question, 2021, is this more going to be a recession year or a recovery year?
Recovery.
What's your number one goal for 2021?
That's not a yes and no question.
No, that's not, actually. I'll have to talk to the editorial staff about that.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what I think should happen in 2021, right? So I'm going to be a little bit lengthier than I imagine. So in international security, we have this notion of internal balancing, right? So you can outcompete your adversaries either by forming a bigger alliance, right? Or by building your economic resiliency to be able to afford, amazing military capabilities, right? I'm hoping we will achieve a higher level of internal balancing in 2021. And I'm certain that the current administration will get us there. I mean, you'll see a lot more insourcing taking place in 2021. And I think so for a lot of business leaders, I think this will be an amazing opportunity. Also, supply chain risk is like all the rage right now, right? So how do you address supply chain risk? A lot of times insourcing, right? Or essentially diversifying to your reliable partners and allies, right? And I think those two things will present amazing business opportunities for 2021.
Who are some people in the industry that you're in that you think are thought leaders that you follow?
That's not a yes and no question.
I know. I'm going to have to talk to the staff about this. Yep.
I'm going to sound a little bit, nepotistic against my own principle. But I follow H.R. McMaster very closely. He's local to me. He's at Stanford. I live in San Francisco. I've known him for a while. I also follow Peter Singer, a dear friend of mine, very closely, right? And then there is another person that I follow very carefully, and that is, I don't know whether this is even appropriate anymore, but Laura Rosenberger, she was with the Alliance for Securing Democracies. Now she's pulled into the Biden administration, but she has done some amazing work to promote not only our interests but values here at home and overseas. So those are perhaps the three thought leaders I follow very carefully.
Anything that you're listening to or reading right now that you'd like to share with others?
Actually, I have not right now, but I do want to recommend two books that I have recently finished, and also actually reviewed one of them. One is Burn In by P.W. Singer. It's an amazing fiction about what we may have to expect with the acceleration of automation and artificial intelligence, right? The other one is The Battleground by H.R. McMaster, that essentially defines what is at stake between the CCP and us now and beyond, right? I think these two books, paint a really good picture about how we should compete, right? And look, this is not me going America, America, America. That's not what I'm doing at all, right? There is a much bigger strategic and historical implication to take into account, and that is, you know, we make a lot of mistakes, right? And we are terrible to each other from time to time, right? However, I still like the international order that we built and maintain much better than what China may do, what the Chinese Communist Party may replace that international order with, right? And let's just think about that again.
That's a great point. And I guess the last question, that's a very important point. But the last question is, what's your favorite podcast besides Non-Beta Alpha, of course?
Oh, you make it very hard. Can I offer two? I want to offer two, right? So the math science podcast, right, is really good. I've done it a couple of times, right? But they really try to educate the public about what we call security futures, right? So in stock trading, you guys have futures, right? In geopolitics, we also have futures. We call them security futures, right? So that's an amazing program. On a more civilian side of the equation, I really like NPR's Hidden Brain, right? It's a great series because it talks all about artificial intelligence, right? Data science, what it means for social resiliency, public health, public safety, and whatnot, right? And also it really talks a lot about some of the most peculiar issues that intersect technology and social resiliency, right? And those would be my two favorites, Ryan.
Duan, thank you for your thought leadership. Thank you for your time and the insights you shared. I think the topics that you cover in your day-to-day are critical for the business community and financial advisors to start to appreciate, because the future is not promised for tomorrow. It can still, spiral into an Orwellian future, or it can become the democratic future that we hope it will be. Thank you for what you do, and hope to talk to you soon.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me. If I were to add just one last footnote, right? And this is something that I have shared with my DoD friends and students for many, many years. Look up what crisis means in Chinese characters, right? And think about insourcing, and think about moving major production manufacturing bases out of the CCP. To me, this is not a crisis. Yes, it is, but it is also it's like once a lifetime opportunity, literally, right? Because when you move large things around the globe, right? These are amazing business opportunities to seize, right? So keep that in mind. We will see a lot of dynamic things taking place in 2021. I'm very optimistic.
I believe if I know my Mandarin, it's merging danger and opportunity.
There you go. Very good. Very good. Very good. Unstable opportunity. To be precise, is literally unstable opportunity.
Unstable opportunity. Thank you so much, and I'll stay in touch. Appreciate you.
Will do. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye.
This show is brought to you by StatusJet. Elevate your status. Fly anywhere, anytime, and experience the difference. Visit statusjet.com to charter your private jet today. Thanks for listening to this episode of Non-Beta Alpha. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube so you never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or simply share this episode with your friends. And now you know.
All price references and market forecasts correspond to the date of this recording. This podcast should not be copied, distributed, published, or reproduced in whole or in part. The information contained in this podcast does not constitute research or recommendation from Non-Beta Alpha Inc., Wentworth Management Services LLC, or any of their affiliates to the listener. Neither Non-Beta Alpha Inc., Wentworth Management Services LLC, nor any of their affiliates make any representation or warranty as to the accuracy or completeness of the statements or any information contained in this podcast, and any liability, therefore, including in respect of direct, indirect, or consequential loss or damage, is expressly disclaimed. The views expressed in this podcast are not necessarily those of Non-Beta Alpha Inc. or Wentworth Management Services LLC, and Non-Beta Alpha Inc. and Wentworth Management Services LLC are not providing any financial, economic, legal, accounting, or tax advice or recommendations in this podcast. In addition, the receipt of this podcast by any listener is not to be taken as constituting the giving of investment advice by Non-Beta Alpha Inc. or Wentworth Management Services LLC to that listener, nor to constitute such person a client of any affiliate of Non-Beta Alpha Inc. or Wentworth Management Services LLC. This does not constitute an offer to buy or sell any security. Investments in security may not be suitable for all investors. An investment of any security may involve risk and the potential loss of your initial investment. Investors should review all risk factors before investing. Investors should perform their own due diligence before considering any investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investment products, insurance, and annuity products are not FDIC insured, not bank guaranteed, not insured by a federal government agency, may lose value.